I'm so pleased to be here with you all today. Thank you once again to the organizers, to the facilitators of the conference, and also to all of you for such a wonderful and stimulating series of talks. It's a real pleasure to be here. And on that note, it's also my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Julian Degen, who is currently at the University of Trier, a university which he joined after completing his PhD in ancient history and ancient Near Eastern studies at the University of Innsbruck. He has also been a fellow and taught at the universities of Innsbruck, Hildesheim, Kiel, and Trier. He is currently working on his Habilitation project, which I will not jinx by saying how close to being finished it is, which examines maritime economies in the Mediterranean world of Strabo's Geographica. His other research interests include Greek historiography, Alexander of Macedon, the Achaemenids, and the economy of the Roman Empire. Today, I think he will speak on several of these topics in a paper titled Narrating Imperial Success from the Achaemenid Period to the Late Roman Republic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Degen.
Thank you, Jonathan, for this very kind introduction. And I want to begin my talk, of course, with thank you to my dear friends, Professor Rollinger and Professor Shaigan, for this kind invitation to speak here, this wonderful conference. And of course, a big thank you to Astrid for organizing this wonderful gathering. Thank you. And before I start, I have to excuse myself for two things. First, for my rather weak voice, but as an Austrian who spent the last years working in Germany, I'm not anymore accustomed to the rough weather in the Alps. And this second point, my title indicates I will end in the late Roman Republic. Actually, I will expand my talk to the Imperial period. Okay, so how did ancient empires claim success? There are no easy answers to this question, as the theme of imperial success involves the complex field of world views. James W. Sire has defined world view as a concept of the cognitive orientation of societies which encompasses the totality of a society's knowledge of the world. This definition suggests that worldviews are the result of the collection of attitudes, values, stories, and expectations of societies. The worldviews of empires thus are the frameworks that define imperial success. Even if we would expect that empires have created unique worldviews, those were interrelated in some way, and therefore they allow comparison. A common feature of these worldviews is that they are based upon geographical concepts, expressed through imperial rhetoric or, respectively, language of power. Accordingly, geography presented the discursive framework for narrating imperial success. Analyzing such geographical concepts, therefore, allows us to study the way how imperial formations have responded to the discourse on empire. Based on the idea that the discourse on empire dictated the way how empires have narrated success, I will argue that their worldviews underwent a transformative process of ideation through the first millennium BCE. The Achaemenid Empire played a decisive role within this process, as the geographical concepts that underlie its worldview became the intellectual backdrop against which succeeding empires narrated imperial success. My talk includes two segments. First, I will outline the persistence of geographical concepts by discussing the occurrences of one particular trope in the rhetoric of various empires. Then the focus of the discussion is being moved to some adaptations of this geographical concept that have been made in order to dynamize the discourse on empire. I shall begin with discussing a trope that conveyed imperial success throughout the first millennium BCE, namely the trope of ruling all the lands from the rising sun until its setting. This trope is steeped in tradition in the ancient Near East, where it has frequently been used to express universalism. This is the idea, the theoretical and not factual claim to control the entire world. However, Even though universalism was the factor that defined imperial success throughout the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE, this idea was further developed in the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian period. To narrate success, the Assyrian and Babylonian kings claimed control over all the lands on which the sun shines. This trope continued in importance in Achaemenid time. Although our knowledge of Achaemenid imperial narratives is limited to a small number of royal inscriptions and Greek texts, there is still much reason to believe that the Achaemenids used a large variety of tropes in the today lost imperial media. Undergone has shown that the so-called lists of lands found in the Achaemenid royal inscriptions are basically a description of the empire that begins at sunrise, representing the east, and ends at sunset, representing the west. Based on the same idea, the Achaemenids differently expressed this idea by claiming to control, quote, this great earth far and wide, end of quote. This interpretation is further supported by the response of some Greek writers to Achaemenid imperialism. Beginning with the Greek tragic poet Aeschylus, roughly dating in the early 5th century BCE, a tradition that associates sunrise and sunset with imperialism has been introduced in the Greek world. In the play The Percy, the chorus is represented by a group of Persians who locate the city of Athens at sunrise. Here the city is pinpointed at the horizon, literally representing the extremes of the world. This statement suggests that the chorus in Aeschylus' play views the world from the perspective of the empire. Aside with that, a passage in Herodotus' Histories, composed at the end of the 5th century BCE, is guided by the same geographical principle. This passage is a part of a speech that Xerxes gave in the Crown Council in the context of the debate on whether or not to campaign against the Greeks. According to Herodotus, Xerxes aimed at conquering the whole of Europe as he decided to rule all the lands that the sun beholds. However, although past scholars have argued that Herodotus traveled far and thereby acquired knowledge, the inhabitants of the Aegean world rather easily obtained such geographical information from imperial narratives. As we learn from Aeschines, an Athenian politician and orator in the age of Alexander, the Achaemenids have sent letters to the Greeks that were fraught with geographical statements. He acceptedly refers to the great king's claim to rule all the lands between sunrise and sunset in order to give the audience an example of the proud imperial rhetoric. An excellent example of the persistence of the Assyro-Babylonian tropes until the Hellenistic period is the cylinder of Antiochus I found in Babylon. The Babylonian scribes who composed the text used the age-old trope in order to highlight the universalism of the empire. Interestingly enough, even though the Seleucid Empire rooted deep in Assyro-Babylonian traditions, the same trope occurs in Hellenistic empires other than those that emerged in the Near East. This is given by the imperial aspirations of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, as praised by Callimachus in his hymn to Delos. Given this tradition, the fact comes rather unsurprisingly that Roman authors of the Republican and early imperial period continued to associate this trope with imperial aspirations. As for instance, this trope is the geographical principle that guides Cicero's description of the world that is dominated by Rome. Ovid, Seneca, and Petronius describe through the same trope the universalism that has been realized by the Roman empires of their days. And finally, Aelius Aristides used this trope in an euphemistic and hagiographic oration in order to praise the power of Rome under the reign of Emperor Antoninus Pius. As we see, this trope was used over centuries and in different cultural contexts without losing its original meaning. Given this tradition, the geographical concept that underlines this claim deserves closer examination. Of course, the idea to rule all the regions that are located between sunrise and sunset, or respectively all the lands between east and west, means the entire world until the horizon. Question remain, however, about the definition of the horizon as a liminal space that represents the extremes of the world. Answering this question is a matter of geographical concepts. It is worth stressing that sunrise and sunset are rather symbolic locations than geographical benchmarks, since they vary during the course of the year. Aside with that, ancient civilizations differently imagined the edges of the world. As, for instance, the ancient Near Eastern ideas of the extremes of the world are not entirely corresponding to those of the Greeks. This applies in particular to the cosmic sea that formed the extremes of the world in Greco-Roman thought. The Neo-Assyrian account of the so-called journey of Vedana and the eagle into the heavens is evidence that the sea was perceived as a trough, a closed body of water. Using this information to draw a map is fraught with problems, as we would bear in mind that the trough-like shape of the sea applies to the entire cosmic sea. This aspect is important to consider when interpreting the so-called Babylonian map of the world. On this map, the terrestrial part that represents the world is encircled by the cosmic sea, to which is referred as the Maratu. The term Maratu is accompanied by the determinative it too that usually designates a channel in Babylonian. This idea is promoted by the cosmic sea as presented in the Babylonian map of the world, where this body of water hosts indefinite portions of land referred as the Nagus. These distant, remote, and mythical regions were ideologically charged points of reference in the Assyrian imperial rhetoric. A classic example of this idea is the location of the land Lydia in the inscriptions of Ashurbanipal. This region is referred to as a Nagu in the cosmic sea, thus qualifying Lydia to be a remote and distant region. The ability to grasp, reach, and finally control such distant lands was believed to be a feature of the sun god Shamash and the mythical hero Gilgamesh. They are thought to have traversed the cosmic sea. Accordingly, the cosmic sea was not an indefinite body of water, but a space consisting of water and land that marks the fringes of the empire. And this mental map is the backdrop against which ancient Near Eastern empires made their claims to power. Empires modified this mental map in a manner that it fulfilled their purposes. Darius I, and hence the idea of universalism that the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Thespian rulers before him had generated. He realized the idea of universalism by claiming to control all the lands that were laid on both sides of the cosmic sea and the desert. With this claim, he outperformed the imperial aspirations of all preceding and future rulers. In other words, there's nothing left to conquer in the mental map. Accordingly, succeeding rulers like Xerxes, Alexander, and Seleucus had to act out the ancient script by claiming the crossing of the cosmic sea, just to claim universalism. Geographical concept that underlined the Achaemenid worldview has become the common sense for narrating imperial success in the first millennium BCE. A good example of the influence of this geographical concept on later empires is the scope of geographical knowledge presented in the Res Gestae of Augustus, composed almost 500 years after the reign of Darius I. Here, the extremes of the world are represented by the Eastern and Western Ocean, the River Tanais, the Caucasus, Ethiopia, Arabia, and finally India. All these lands, regions, and rivers were theoretically encompassed in the claim to universalism of Darius. Even though Western Europe is not mentioned by name in the Achaemenid royal inscriptions, this region is still included in the claim to rule all the lands beyond the cosmic sea. Given the word of Herodotus, it is possible to say that the Achaemenids even claimed to rule over all the Germanic tribes that Augustus mentions. He states that the Persians refer to all the inhabitants of the northern hemisphere as Sake. These Sake are included in the Achaemenid lists of lands, thus the great king counted them among the subject peoples. As we see, the scope of the mental map that was used to narrate imperial success has not changed in the time from Darius to Augustus. Nevertheless, as I shall demonstrate in the second segment of my talk, the discourse on empire was guided by the principle of anything goes, rather than it developed into static geographical knowledge. The idea that Darius has realized remained uncontested throughout the Achaemenid period. Things, however, decidedly changed when Alexander has begun to convert conquest into rule by contesting the achievements of the Achaemenids. Concerning geography, the historiography related to Alexander is guided by two main principles. Firstly, reaching regions that remained untouched by the Achaemenids is presented as the major goal of Alexander. Secondly, Alexander sought to discover previously uncharted regions. Interpreting these statements is at the center of a debate that pits modern historians in opposing camps over whether to view him as a conqueror or a discoverer. The idea that Alexander felt the sting of curiosity is less a realistic description of Alexander's objectives than this is an idea that has been constructed in the discourse on empire. Given the fact that the structures of mental maps could not have decidedly been modified without risking to lose the defining properties, reassessing the meaning of space has become the new stimulus to the discourse on empire. If the values associated with specific landmarks and regions in mental maps can be modified and changed, such a mental map has the features of a cognitive map. Cognitive maps are generally understood as the internal representation of large objects that cannot be grasped in their entirety by the means of a single cognitive act, as for instance large cities or empires. Cognitive maps are constructed by a series of landmarks that define the structure of space. They can be charged with values and emotions, thereby creating a cognitive landscape. Modifying an already existing cognitive landscape through landmarks thus has the potential to dynamize the discourse on empire. Even though this is very important to bear in mind, because even though intense archaeological investigations have shown that the world of the first millennium BCE was intensely connected by human networks, the rhetoric of empire is still guided by the idea of a world divided into discovered and uncharted spaces. Given the common definition of discovery as the result of exploring something that has previously been unknown, we can observe that empires are inclined to influence the scope of geographical knowledge of societies and thereby their cognitive landscape when they put themselves in a dominant place in the prevailing discourse. This is illustrated by the following examples. Ancient Near Eastern rulers defined political success as surpassing the achievements of former rulers. Contesting the predecessors thus developed by time into an agonistic atmosphere that presented the discursive framework for the legitimation of authority. Consequently, pushing beyond the fringes of the mental map was a link with discovery in the worldview of empires and therefore presented an act of discovery in imperial narratives. Due to the massive expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, this idea made it necessary to locate conquered places and regions of the mental map that presented the extremes of the world. Carrying conquest to such regions was associated with discovery and therefore fostered the agonistic behaviors of rulers. Thus, reaching the extremes of the world in imperial narratives was accompanied with the claim of being the first ruler to have reached distant and remote places. Such statements were guided by the principles that conquest is the motor which allows the constant expanding of the geographical horizon. Unsurprisingly, reaching distant and remote places that were previously unknown has developed into a central feature of royal qualities. An inscription of the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, for instance, highlights the ability of this ruler to reach distant lands and places that nobody has advanced thus far. Along with the imperial euphoric, the authors of the classical geographical texts also linked conquest with discovery. This relation is exemplified by Herodotus' descriptions of India and the surrounding sea. He states that Darius has discovered these previously unknown regions. This statement can only be understood when located in the wider frame of the attempts of the ancient Near Eastern empires to constantly expand towards the east. Interestingly, the same argument can be found in Plutarch's description of Alexander's symbolic trip to the Indian Ocean. Here it is said Alexander prayed to the gods in a manner that reminds us much of the Assyrian kings when they narrated imperial success. And this passage also has the flavor of discovery. Despite the slight differences caused by the translation into a different cultural context, the persistence of this principle can be exemplified by the res gesti of Augustus. He proudly states that no Roman commander, save himself, has ever met an Indian embassy by locating India at the easternmost fringes of the world. The discourse on empire had a considerable bearing on the Mediterranean societies in a sense that it influenced the scope of their geographical knowledge. This idea is exemplified by Polybius' division of the world into two sorts of geographical spaces. Whilst the empire, the Roman Empire, constitutes a space within which empirical investigation can take place, the geographical knowledge of the non-imperial world, however, remains imperfect. The same division of the body of geographical knowledge can be attested to the geography of Strabo and the so-called Periplus Maris Erythraei. Both texts have been written by Hellenistic scholars under the influence of the ideology that has been promoted by the first Roman emperors. In the eyes of Strabo, Roman imperialism is the power that promotes discovery, despite the fact that imperial formations other than the Roman Empire have also contributed to the increase of the body of geographical knowledge. Nonetheless, it is noteworthy that the idea of a world divided by two empires has a great bearing on Strabo's description of the Achaemenid. His description of the world outside the Roman Empire is based on ancient accounts, and therefore he does not intend to add any new information to the existing body of geographical knowledge. The same principles apply to the construction of space in the Periplus Maris Erythraei, composed in the early imperial period. The anonymous author explains that the Chinese people dwell close to the ocean that encircles the world. Even the remotest spots in the Roman imagination of the world is set within the limits of the mental map that dominated the discourse on empire. Locating this place in a region that cannot be reached due to divine influence, however, reveals that the principle of discovery still dominated the manner how ancient empires narrated imperial success. And the fact he was mentioning that these Chinese people, the Tainei, are not mentioned in any of the Roman imperial propagandistic or official texts that represent the Roman official language. By way of conclusion, in light of the evidence discussed here, it can be said that one geographical concept has presented the discursive framework for narrating imperial success in the first millennium BCE. This geographical concept has significantly been modified by Darius I in a manner that the principle of expanding the empire until the horizon finally lost its significance. The idea of the horizon has not been further enhanced. By modifying the cognitive landscape of this geographical concept, imperial success underwent a redefinition in the post-Achaemenid period. Although the idea of discovery has been introduced in pre-Achaemenid time, it created great importance for any ruler who attempted to put themselves in a dominant place in the prevailing discourse on empire. In other words, modifying the prevalent cognitive landscape was a possibility that allowed to contest the universalism realized by the Achaemenids. If what has been argued here has the ring of plausibility, the manner of narrating imperial success in the first millennium BCE was heavily influenced by the Achaemenid worldview. Thank you very much for your attention.